hatred, carnality, shame. And God looks down at us and sees what we commit. Every sin we commit makes that brick one much heavier on our back that we have to carry in that load of shame and guilt. And it goes heavier and heavier until we're crushed beneath that load. You know, can you remember that? I mean, I hope every one of us here are professing Christians today. And if you are, can you remember before you came to Christ? Can you remember what it was like back then, before you knew Jesus, and you had that burden of guilt and shame that just beat you down and held you down, and it got to where you felt like you couldn't care it anymore, and you couldn't go any farther if you couldn't find grace and peace and forgiveness, like the old song said, shackled by a heavy burden, neath a load of guilt and shame. But then the hand of Jesus touched me, and now I'm no longer the same. He touched me, He touched me. And oh, the joy that floods my soul. Something happened. And now I know He touched me and He made me whole. There's another group of people in that crowd He could have been talking to. They could have been you and me. And that's the ones that were believers, but they were still burdened down by the cares of this life. Who are burdened down by problems and tests and trials that seem sometimes almost too heavy to bear. Now listen. I hope you realize the Christian life is the best life there is. There's no question about that. The most joy, the most peace comes from being a Christian. But you and I know as well as anybody else, that doesn't mean there ain't going to be problems. Doesn't mean there's not going to be trials and tests and burdens that we have to carry in our lifetimes. Even after you become a Christian, sometimes maybe it seems like it's because you become a Christian. And these trials and temptations and tests and burdens rise until we're almost crushed. And we kind of lose our faith in God, and we start saying, God, where are you? And why don't you do something? And why don't you answer my prayers? And why don't you come in and work these things out? Oh, God, what am I going to do? I'm so tired. I'm so weary. I'm so burdened. It's just too much for me to bear. Am I the only person that ever felt that way as a Christian? But I want to tell you something. When you get to that point in your life, there's somebody much stronger and has much broader shoulders than you and I who will help us carry those burdens. And Jesus says, come to me if you labor and are heavy laden. Or James says, cast all your cares upon Him, because He cares for you. When the burdens of life are almost too much for you, it says, come to Jesus. I want you to know something else in this passage, beyond the character of those who are called, but I want you to notice also there's a command in this passage. In verse 29, Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Now, I think sometimes we fail here as preachers. We talk about the call of God and trying to get people converted and coming to Christ and answering that call. But we forget there's also a command. He says, take my yoke upon you. Submit yourself to my authority. He says, if you're going to accept my call, you must also accept my yoke. And acknowledge the lordship of Christ. Now, I'm sure we all know, even the young people know, what an ox yoke looked like. Right? You know, that big wooden thing you put over the neck of the oxen so that the person who's driving the oxen could keep them under control. And Jesus is saying, if you want to come to me, if you want to have your burdens lifted, if you want me to ease your weary soul, then you must submit yourself to me and to my authority and my control, and let me be master of your life. That's what he's saying. Let me be master of your life. It's interesting, he goes on here and says, and learn of me. You say, well, what is that? What's that mean? Well, it's kind of interesting. In the first century, in the Jewish teaching, when you use that phrase to learn, to take up your yoke, it also meant go to school. They use it the same way. And the master teacher is telling us, all of us here today, come to school and let me teach you how you're supposed to live. Let me train you. Let me show you what I expect out of you. And listen, serving Jesus should be a daily learning experience. As you read your Bible, as you pray, as you go to church, as you fellowship, as you work on your job, as you go to school, every day is a learning experience. And God's going to show you, here's what I expect out of you guys. Here's what I expect out of you gals. Here's how you're supposed to change. I'm making you over into my image. I'm rubbing off the rough edges. I want to make you my disciples worthy of the name Christian. To take upon yourself the yoke of Christ means being willing to submit yourself to His lordship and accept Him. And this command emphasizes there's also a cost to discipleship. Jesus doesn't only call you, He's not begging you to be a Christian. He's commanding you to take up the yoke. Now I can ask us all here today, have you accepted the yoke? Have you accepted His authority? Are you willing to bow your stubborn neck to His yoke? Or do sometimes we still kick against the pricks like He talks about Paul in the book of Acts and try to have our own way and reject His teaching? He didn't just call us, He commands us to take up His yoke. Now I think probably the pattern of this passage we like the best is the third command we see in verse 29 and 30, which is the comfort that Christ offers me. If we'll accept His call, if we'll accept His command, He says, He says, take your yoke upon me and learn from me. Notice what it says here. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. He says the same thing back in verse 28. I will give you rest. In the presence of Jesus, you'll find rest for your soul. I'm convinced Jesus is really the only one that can give us rest, because He's the only one that can remove the burden of sin. He's the only one that can help us carry the load during the tough times. Now, again, I've known lots of people, and I've probably been one of them at a time or two where I've tried to solve my problems on my own, and I think I can handle it by myself, and I think I can make the decisions, and I think, or some people think, well, just by going to church and being a member or doing this or that, somehow I'm going to solve the problem. But it doesn't work that way, because Jesus says, I'm the only one that can give rest to the weary. The only place you're going to find peace is in Him. He repeats it in verse 29, and he says it a little bit differently here. He says, for you will find rest for your soul. Now, he said, that rest is only going to come if you're willing to take up the yoke first. And notice what he also says here. It's kind of funny. I wondered about this. He says, take my yoke upon you, learn of me. Notice this next phrase. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. He said, well, what's that got to do with anything? Why is the fact that Jesus is gentle and humble of heart got anything to do with me finding rest for my soul? Well, I think what it says to me is this. If Jesus had to humble Himself to obey the Father's will, if He had to humble Himself and say, not thy will be done, how much more are we going to have to humble ourselves to God if we're going to have any peace for our soul? As long as somehow, in some way, we think in our own ability and our own pride, we can solve our own problems and make our own path, we're never going to have peace. Somehow we have to humble ourselves and bend our proud neck and accept the yoke of Jesus Christ if we're going to find rest. God calls us to that. He says, give up your burden of sin. Give up the trials and the things. Accept my yoke and you'll find rest. But until you're ready to accept His call, it'll never be there. Now, I don't know why I'm getting a little blurb here, but I want you to pay close attention here as I get ready to close on this last phrase. This last verse, because this is a strange one sometimes, and people have trouble with this. He says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, think with me just for a second, please. Pay attention. We're almost done. Now, some might say, Dr. Weeder, I'm a Christian, and I know that I need to submit to the Lordship of Christ, and I know never